Kelly Cahill. I'm a UFO experiencer, and on the 8th of August 1993 I was involved in a multiple witness close encounter which took place on the outskirts of Melbourne in Victoria. This case has been described by many researchers as possibly the most credible case in Australian history so far, and what makes it so different to any other encounter is that it involved the testimonies of separate individual parties of witnesses who were unknown to each other. In addition to this, a substantial amount of physical evidence was also recovered during the ensuing investigation, including ground traces at the encounter location, as well as physical marks left on the bodies of at least 4 of the individuals involved, including myself. Today I'd like to relate to you my own personal involvement in the Umemmering Creek encounter, as it's officially titled, as well as show you a series of slides of the comparison sketches between myself and the second party, and also some photographs of both the ground traces and other marks. The one thing that I'd like to stress, and I always do, is that because there were 5, possibly 6 individuals involved in the encounter and I was only one of them, I can only speak about what I personally perceived to occur that night. But where I can do so, I'll endeavour to fill you in on what I have learned about the second party's participation. And just as a clarifier, there were 3 members in that party, 1 male and 2 females. For those of you who are familiar with the case, you'd already be aware of the presence of a third party at the encounter that evening, a party reportedly seen by the second group. This lone male has always been a mystery to everyone involved with the case, but it looks like the mystery is about to come to a close. For the first time ever, I'll be able to offer you a little information on the third party, who's only just come forward after 3 long years. Because of this, the last week or two has been pretty exciting for both us experiencers involved in the encounter and the researchers alike. Not only does it seem like we've actually found the 1 male witness who's been missing, been the missing link ever since the case first came to light, but it also appears he has his own photographic evidence of the marks left on his body after the encounter, which correspond in quite a striking way to several of the marks left on Glenda, who was one of the female members of the second party. This is one of the issues I'll deal with a little later, but for now I'd like to give my own personal rendition of the events which occurred that night, so you can get some idea of what went on there, well, at least from my perspective. So this is what happened shortly after midnight on the 8th of August 1993. I guess it all really began as my ex-husband and I were driving home from a friend's house in the country town of Monbulk in Victoria. At the time we were driving along Belgrave-Hallam Road, which is between the small Victorian town of Belgrave and the outer Melbourne suburb of Narre Warren, which I'll show you on a map if I can get this thing working. Yeah, there we go. Toward the bottom of the map you can see where suburbia begins, and that's Narre Warren North. If you follow the main road there along towards the top of the map, eventually you'll come to Belgrave. It's actually not on that map. On that night we were coming from Belgrave towards Narre Warren. In other words, we were coming from the top to the bottom of the map. As we were driving, we spotted something which at first appeared to resemble a lit-up blimp. It was hovering in the sky above the road at approximately twice the height of the treetops. And as we drove closer, it became more defined and seemed to be a structure consisting of a row of round orange lights. At the time, I assumed that these lights were windows because there appeared to be figures, or at least silhouettes of figures standing in them. And I commented to my husband on the people in the windows, and it was almost as if I'd been heard. The craft just shot off to the left from a standing start. It accelerated at an incredible speed, and within about 2 seconds it had completely disappeared. Obviously, we were both pretty amazed at what we'd just seen, and we continued to talk about it as we drove further on down the road. After about a kilometre or 2, we were confronted by, I guess, what I can only describe as a barrier of very bright light that seemed to block off the entire road. It's also at this point where I lost all conscious recollection of the ensuing events until a few weeks later. The light that we came across in that location was so bright that I found it necessary to use my hand to shade my eyes in order to hear through the windscreen. By that stage, my heart was pounding with excitement and the adrenaline was racing through my body, and the last thing I remember saying to my husband was, I can't believe this, we're really going to see a UFO. And in the next instant, we were still sitting in the car, although we appeared to be going a lot slower and it covered some distance. And my heartbeat was calm, and I was totally disorientated, as if I'd missed something. And I said to my husband, weren't we going to see a UFO or something? And he said, I think so. And he seemed just as disorientated as I was. But After a few minutes, he seemed to regain his composure, and we spent the rest of our trip home arguing that I believed I'd had a blackout. And when we arrived home and checked the clock, it seemed that an hour to an hour and a half had gone missing from our lives. And that night, I also discovered a red triangular mark beneath my navel, a perfect equilateral triangle that looked like a little red burn. As well as that, I'd started bleeding, and this continued for 3 to 3.5 weeks until I was hospitalised with an infection in the womb, which is a problem for which there was no logical medical explanation. What I find to be interesting about the point in the road where we were confronted by the barrier of light is the extremely unusual experience a second party underwent in roughly the same location. They'd arrived at this particular point about 10 minutes before us, and they'd all instantly been overcome with such severe nausea that they lost control of the car, spun out and hit a pole. Although, from what I was told, there was little damage done to the car itself, they were forced to sit on the side of the road until they felt well enough to travel. Then, just as they were about to pull back onto the road, 2 other cars passed them, one of which they believed to be ours, and the other, a third vehicle, which they later reported to be parked approximately 25 metres behind them at the actual encounter scene. There we go. Right. The first point marked out on the road map, the one by itself up the top there, point A, is where the second party had their minor accident, and also where I believe to have encountered the barrier of light. And as we all drove into the encounter scene together, the lower location marks show the order in which we appeared to pull up when we sighted the craft in the field. The first car, right down the bottom, car number 1, is where my husband and myself stopped. Car number 3 was the car following us, which was reported by the second party. And then it appears that the second party themselves then pulled up between both of us in position number 2 there. Before I continue with the actual encounter details, I'd just like to quickly describe how the memories of the encounter events returned. To me, it was really strange that a human being could actually forget something so obviously powerful, but that's exactly what happened. And it wasn't until a number of weeks later, when we were travelling along that same road again, that this hitting time bomb went off. And for no reason at all, I was suddenly overcome by the most incredible sensation of horror, and my gut literally sank as if someone had died. And from that moment on, I began to recall what had happened after we confronted the light. And this memory, it wasn't something that could even begin to be compared to a dream or imagination. It was real memory of real experience. I knew then with absolute surety that we'd been involved in a close encounter, and sitting in the car when all this was coming back to me, I felt like I wanted to scream, "This can't be happening," and I went into absolute shock. When I recalled those memories, and probably for the next few months, I thought I was going absolutely crazy, but these days with the field evidence and a second party of witnesses and just recently a third individual, well, that theory sort of went out the window. Anyway, when we stopped the car, we got out and crossed the road, and I noticed the second car and its occupants doing the same. That was the one thing I was very insistent upon when I first went forward to researchers, that there were other people at the same encounter location, and there was no doubt in my mind that they'd also left their vehicle and crossed the road as we'd done. And that insistence was what actually prompted the search for the second party, who then approached researchers about 6 weeks later. This photograph taken from the field itself gives you a general idea of the topography of the area. The road running around the top of the field, over there on the left, you can just see it in the corner, was where we all pulled up. Our party right near the top there, the second party about 100 metres behind us, and the third vehicle a little further down the road, just a bit outside the photograph. The full front view of the field here is where the craft was, approximately 170 metres in from the side of the road. According to the second group, the third vehicle contained a single male occupant who stayed in the car with the headlights on, and later researchers recreating the scene under similar conditions discovered that the only feasible reason why I'd been able to see the second party at all was solely because their car and they were backlit by the headlights of the third car. At that stage, there weren't any street lamps on that particular road, so without the headlights from the third car, the second group would have been almost impossible to see. And this also explains why the second party hadn't seen us ahead of them at the encounter scene, although they had seen us passing them a kilometre or so back down the road. That little problem turned out to be quite a blessing in the long run because it provided grounds for extremely unbiased research. Not only were the other witnesses able to take researchers back to the same location as myself, but also the sketches we all drew of the craft and beings were drawn independently. Mine in the beginning, when the second party hadn't yet been located, and theirs a little later without being aware that someone else had also observed the same thing. The second party wasn't made aware of our presence that evening until the research on their roles in the encounter had been completed, which was well into the following year. As for the third party, up until a week ago, the occupant of the other car still hadn't been located, but in response to a recent article in Who magazine, it seems that there is very real chance that our mysterious third party has finally been found. His stories and particulars matched many of the detailed criteria researchers were actually looking for, details that not even I or the other party were aware of. And just to give you an example, Jane, one of the female members from the second party, actually reported seeing, I think it was a red dragon lit up before the encounter, and the researchers could never actually figure out what this meant. And this letter that was received, along with the photographs, actually stated that there might be something that we could all relate to, a signifier. If any of us had seen, they had some sort of a logo on their car which was fluorescent, and it was a red dragon, and with a dark car in the night it looked like a red dragon flying past. So these were the little indicators that researchers were actually looking for. It also appears that his own photographic evidence of the physical marks on his body correspond with the 3 circular marks found on the inside thigh of both the female member of the second party, as well as a match to the ligature mark around Glenda's left ankle. For the moment, all I really know is that the individual involved is a lawyer of sorts and lives locally to where the encounter took place. PRA, Phenomena Research Australia, is hoping to secure further detailed information on the third party in the near future. And I believe that when this happens, it'll provide one of the best testimonies of individual witnesses to have ever been presented anywhere in the world. And this case has already become a landmark in Australian ufology and could possibly become a case decider on the UFO phenomena for people everywhere. And I'm not saying that because this is my case, but because there were other people there who saw and experienced the same phenomena, and that's just about as real as you can get. Anyway, I'm getting a little sidetracked here. To continue on with the story, as my husband and I stood watching the craft about 10 metres in from the side of the road, and here might actually be a good time to describe the craft so you can get a good idea of exactly what we were looking at. Sorry about that. This is a copy of the original sketch I submitted to Phenomena Research Australia during the early research process. Sorry about the quality, but that's what happens when you're forced to use your kids' crayons. The craft we saw consisted of a row of round orange lights, a little like large amber traffic lights, and when I say large, I mean huge. They each would have been big enough for a person to stand up in full length. Beneath these circles was a formation of blue fluorescent light, and whether or not it was solid or gaseous is something that I'm actually not sure of, although it certainly seemed to be a part of the structure of the craft. This blue light structure descended from the orange circles in a conical fashion and hit the ground in a semicircular or crescent shape. This semicircle was actually one of the ground traces recovered as a magnetic anomaly on the field. Where I've drawn the comparison scale of the human being to the craft down the bottom, I've been assured through research estimates that this scale was relatively accurate. And through using trigonometry, PRA were able to ascertain that the approximate diameter of the craft was something like 50 metres, or the length of an Olympic swimming pool. And to me out there that night, it was probably about the height of a 2 to 3 storey house, so you can see why we wouldn't have been able to mistake it for something like a helicopter. These are the sketches of the craft submitted by Jane and Glenda, the 2 female members of the second party. Notice that although slightly different, the craft has the same basic structure, which obviously isn't the saucer-shaped object so often expected. And like myself, they both drew the crescent shape beneath the craft, but here they've also drawn a tripod structure underneath. This is something that I actually admitted on my own drawing because I didn't notice it on the night, and as I assumed, I wasn't wearing my glasses, and it doesn't really surprise me much, but The tripod obviously was a part of the craft because the corresponding ground traces in a triangular formation were also found during the research process. Just as a matter of interest, I was recently shown these photos from South America, and I couldn't help but notice the similarity in the orange circles. If you could imagine a blue fluorescent structure beneath the orange lights here in these photos, and it would come pretty close to what we saw out on the field. These are the marks left by the tripod sketched by both Jane and Glenda. They were found within the crescent-shaped anomaly and that we believe to have been caused by the blue light structure beneath the craft. These are actually 3 individual photos taken of each mark and arranged vertically for display purposes. But out on the field, they were in a triangular formation, spaced approximately 6 metres apart. This is a microscopic shot of a blade of foliage in the crescent area. There appears to be some kind of abrasion to the leaf, and all the foliage, including the grass within the crescent, was damaged in the same way. Again, the surrounding areas showed no ill effect at all. That's all I really have to show you concerning the physical ground traces, although I believe there were several other anomalies discovered. But for those, I guess we'll all have to wait for the release of the official report on this case to find out any more. John Alcatel and PRA have indicated that they'd like to have the report released by the end of this year, so if all goes well, all this information and hopefully a lot more will become readily available to the general public. Anyway, this time I've really gotten off the track. I've been meaning to get to the main part of the encounter, which was the actual contact. In some ways, it's actually quite a relief for me that you've had the chance to view some of the physical data beforehand, because what happens next sounds more like something out of a B-grade science fiction movie than reality, yet it was as real to me as those ground traces are to researchers. When my husband and I were standing on the side of the field watching the craft, a tall black being seemed to appear right in front of it. 1 second it wasn't there, the next second it was, and this was followed by the appearance of 7 or 8 similar beings right behind him. And that's when I felt the energy force. It hit me like a ton of lead. The only way I can describe this force is to say that it was, well, at least what I believe to be a low-level frequency so powerful that it was as if waves of energy were being pumped through my body. I could literally feel them. Emotionally, all I felt was absolute terror. It was as if I'd been stripped of all of my logical comprehension and left with little more than raw emotional instinct to reason with. And I really think that now I can understand the terror of a wild animal when it's been cornered. Up until that moment, all I'd felt was an absolute sense of awe. I'd gotten out of the car with a smile on my face that I couldn't have wiped off if I'd have tried. And yet within a second, that wonder instantly turned to horror. And this is also the point where I believe the experience of myself and the second party diverged a little bit. After seeing the craft and the beings, the others report hearing a humming noise and then blacking out, only to find themselves somehow transported on board the craft. As for me, I was subjected to an energy force so powerful that these days that's exactly what I believe it was meant to do, to knock me unconscious, yet it didn't quite work. The other 2 women report only a profound sense of calm and peace on the field, and their own personal interpretation is totally different to the hysteria that laced my interpretation. I've often wondered if I had have been knocked unconscious by that energy force instead of being forced to experience it, then maybe I'd have only had recollection of that incredible sense of awe I was feeling only moments before. But instead, I became absolutely hysterical and began screaming that they had no souls. And at that moment, I was absolutely convinced of the accuracy of that statement. I truly believed that the beings we were witnessing had no souls. I've never been able to explain that conclusion quite adequately, but except to say, rather than by any other means, I felt it. In reaction to my yelling, the being's eyes then seemed to light up a blazing red colour, and they came rushing across the field towards us. About halfway across the field, they split up into 2 groups, one heading towards the occupants of the second vehicle, who were 100 metres further down the road from us, and the rest of them heading towards us. They didn't seem to be running, they actually seemed to be gliding a little bit off the ground. This is the original sketch of the beings that I submitted to PRA in the research process. Besides the black or dark faces, there were no other distinguishable features but the eyes themselves. Likewise, Jane and Glenda's sketches of the beings also had the same similarities in both the shape and the absence of mouth, nose or any other facial features but the big round eyes. This in itself is quite unusual because, as most of you would already know, most abductees' depictions of the beings they see usually include large but slanted eyes. This wasn't the case with us. Anyway, in the 3 or 4 seconds it took these beings to cross the 170 metres between us, all I could do was stand there, not so much physically paralysed, but totally transfixed. There really was no time to do anything else. All I could fix on was the blazing red eyes. I often get asked if anything else, if I noticed anything else like hands or feet, but there really wasn't any time. When you're confronted with something so frightening, the minor details aren't something you tend to spend a lot of time looking for. When you're put in a situation like that, the last thing you're thinking is, oh, I've probably got 1.23 seconds left to live, but wait, first I have to find out what colour nail polish they're wearing. Doesn't sort of work that way. Most of you have probably had a nightmare at some stage in your lives, and you'd know the fear that you experience in a nightmare is much more powerful than any fear that you could possibly encounter in real life. And, well, the fear that I felt out there that night was like my worst nightmare coming to life. And just to give you some idea of exactly how terrified I was later on forced to put my head between my knees and throw up out of sheer fear. As I stood there, the next thing I felt was a blow to my stomach that landed me flat on the back in the grass. It literally lifted me off of my feet. I was winded and I was nauseous, but I still managed to pull myself into a sitting position only because I had this intense fear that I was going to die if I didn't. It was then when I sat up that I realised I couldn't see, and I spent the rest of the encounter, or at least what I can recall of it, sitting on my backside in the grass, totally blinded. All I could do was hear and feel. There's an exchange of words out on the side of the field, which involved one audible male voice utilising cliché lines such as "we're a peaceful people," which was pretty hard to believe after what had just happened to me. And for the rest of my conscious recollection, which I can only describe as scattered at best, all I can clearly remember doing is raving about demons and evil, and a throwback to my religious conditioning, I guess. Yet even so, I was totally convinced, and I still am, that I was in the presence of something totally diabolical. At the very last stage of my conscious recollection, I remember a hand being placed on my shoulder in response to this male voice's command, "Will someone do something about her?" And that was it for me. I began invoking the name of God as if there was no tomorrow, and the next thing I recall was being back in the car, severely disorientated and wondering what on earth had happened. Although the incident I just described could have taken no longer than 5 to 10 minutes, I'm still faced with the dilemma of over an hour of missing time. And likewise, the second party also reported a similar amount of unaccountable time lapse. From the other side, Jane and Glenda reported somehow being transported on board the craft. They related the ability to telepathically communicate with each other under these circumstances, and at all stages of the on-board activity, each was aware of what was happening to the other. The two women state that they were strapped down to tables and medically examined, but there certainly seems to be physical evidence to support that. But first, another thing that really interests me, on board the craft, Glenda reported seeing this being, again with no other facial features but the eyes. This particular sketch is of interest to me because of the robes that it was wearing. In the aftermath of the encounter, I was subjected to 4 bedside manifestations over a 5-month period of the same kind of tall, dark being dressed in a black hooded floor-length robe. This diagram indicates the places on Glenda's body where she was marked. All 3 of us women were branded with a triangular mark below our navels, although I still have no idea of where mine came from because I've no further recollection of anything other than being on the side of the field and then back in the car. This is a photograph of the inside of one of the other ladies' legs. Both women from the second party were marked with this vertical line of 3 round dots on their inner thighs. It now seems that the male occupant of the third vehicle was also branded with the same marking. It's a mark which PRA has just recently acquired photographic evidence for. Finally, this is a photograph of the ligature mark on Glenda's ankle, which corresponds in quite a dramatic way with her claim to have been strapped down to a table on board. Again, the male member of the third party was left with a similar ligature mark on the same ankle, the left one. There were also other physical problems with both women in the second party, but because these problems were gynecological, I think it should be up to them to decide if they ever want to discuss it in public. Suffice to say that all of us women suffered some form of gynecological disturbance after the encounter. Well, that basically covers the encounter. For myself, there were ongoing scenarios of bedside manifestations and strange electrical disturbances for quite some time afterwards. These are quite in-depth, and I could go on talking about them for hours, but I don't really have the time for that this morning. So if any of you are still curious about the after effects, they've been quite thoroughly detailed in my book Encounter, which is available here at the conference. So far, as it is, all I've really given you is an overall view of the physical events of the encounter, but it seems that the effects on my life, including my perceptions and beliefs, have all radically altered since the experience and continue to do so. Realms of thought processes and spiritual awareness have really opened up on a new level for me, and these days I find myself in a labyrinth of possibilities and understandings that would never have come to light if it wasn't for the encounter. It seems to have been a trigger to a new awareness that the world and our perception of it is only very limited if we're only able to view it in one very logical or boxed-off way. A UFO encounter has a way of shattering a person's entire concept of reality and then eventually allowing a bigger picture to unfold. For the past 2 years, I've been proactive in promoting the reality of UFO activity to the Australian public. In that time, I've had 2 further sightings, not encounters, but both of these have been in broad daylight with other UFO experiences. This photo was one I took in March last year at 9:30 in the morning over Sydney Harbour. Blown up, it looks like a large white triangle. It sat there in the same spot for 1 to 2 minutes, then seemed to flash and disappear. And this occurred the day after I'd spoken at my first conference. The other sighting I had was again in Sydney with another experiencer, and looked like a large round silver ball bearing floating in and out of the clouds, and no camera this time, but once again it was the day before a major conference, so if you go outside at some stage this afternoon, look up, you never know your luck. Well, I guess that's about it from me. Thanks for your patronage at this session, and I really hope that it'll provide you with a deeper insight not only into my own case but the abduction phenomena as a whole, and in particular that this phenomena is having an effect on real human lives, not just some case study in a textbook. Once again, thanks.